In the spring of 1884, in the Bitterroot Valley of Montana Territory, a young woman stood at the edge of a sagging hayloft with a lantern in one hand and a length of broken rope in the other, and she understood that the thing she had paid $1 for was about to answer a question no one in the county had thought worth asking. The barn around her was rotting where it stood. Half its shingles had gone to the wind years before, and the rain had been allowed inside long enough to blacken the floor joists and curl the planking until it lay like the pages of a forgotten book. The men who had laughed at her purchase were 3 miles away by then, warm in the town of Stevensville, telling the story over their suppers of the orphaned girl who had bought a ruin no one else would touch. They did not know what she had begun to see in the lantern light. They did not know that the loft above her was not empty. Her name was Ada Vance, and she was 20 years old, and 1 week earlier she had owned nothing in the world but the clothes she stood in, and a satchel of carpenter's tools that had belonged to a dead man who taught her everything she knew. Stay with me, because what she found above that rotted floor would settle a debt 30 years old, and the people who had dismissed her would live the rest of their lives knowing they had been wrong. To understand what was buried in that loft, you must first understand how a girl came to be cast out of the only home she had ever known, with $4 to her name and no one left to speak for her. Ada had not been born in Montana. She had come up from a homestead near the Snake River in Idaho, the daughter of a woman who died of fever when Ada was 9, and a father she could no longer clearly remember. When the fever took her mother, it took the farm soon after, and Ada was sent north to her mother's cousin, a hard man named Royce Tarn, who kept a freight and supply concern in Stevensville, and who took the girl in the way a man takes in a stray dog he intends to work. She was not a daughter in that house. She was a pair of hands. She swept the warehouse, hand-counted nail kegs, and learned to read a freight manifest before she learned to read a hymn, and she did all of it without complaint, because she understood early that complaint was a luxury for people who had somewhere else to go. It was in the freight yard that she met the man who would change the shape of her life. His name was Elias Frame, and he was the carpenter and wheelwright Royce Tarn, kept on contract to mend the wagons that came through. An old man then, gray and slow in the mornings, with hands so scarred and sure that Ada used to stop her own work just to watch them. He noticed the girl watching. Most men would have sent her off. Elias instead handed her a draw knife one cold afternoon and showed her how to set the blade to a spoke and pull the curl of wood away clean. And something in Ada that had been waiting a long time woke up and did not go back to sleep. For 11 years Elias Frame taught her. He taught her the grain of every wood that grew between the Bitterroot and the Sapphire ranges, and which would hold a joint and which would split if you looked at it wrong. He taught her to read the age of a building by the cut of its nails and the saw marks on its beams. He taught her that a thing built honest would tell you the truth about itself if you had the patience to listen, and that most men never had the patience, and that this was why most men were fooled. He had no children of his own. He had buried a wife in Walla Walla a long way back, and never spoke of her but once, and Ada understood without being told that she had become the thing he was leaving behind. What Elias gave her, in the end, was not only the skill, it was a way of seeing. He used to say that the frontier was full of men who looked at a thing and saw only what it was worth at that minute, and that those men would always be poor in the way that mattered, because they could not see what a thing had been or what it might yet become. Ada did not fully understand him then. She came to understand him completely on the day she stood in the rotted barn with the lantern, when everything he had taught her arranged itself in an instant into a single clear shape, and she knew. Elias died in the winter of Ada's 20th year. He went the way the old go in hard country, a cough that settled and would not leave, and then a morning when he did not wake. He left her his tools, the whole chest of them, planes and chisels, and the 12-pound maul with the hickory handle worn to the shape of his grip, and he left her nothing else, because he had nothing else. Royce Tarn allowed her 3 days to grieve. On the 4th day he told her that with the old man gone there was no longer cause to feed and house a grown woman who was no kin of his by blood, and that he had found a buyer for the warehouse and meant to move to Helena before the snow, and that she would need to make her own arrangements. He counted 4 silver dollars into her palm, as though the act cost him pain. He told her it was more than he owed her. Then he turned back to his ledgers, and that was the end of 11 years. She did not weep in front of him. She had learned that much. She took the $4 and the chest of tools, which was heavier than she was, and she carried it in 3 trips to the livery, where a man let her sleep in the loft above the horses for the price of mucking the stalls. And there, for 2 nights, Ada Vance lay awake in the straw and did the only thing Elias had ever truly forbidden her to do, which was to despair. On the 3rd morning she got up and went to find work, because despair, she had decided, was another luxury, and she could not afford it. There was no work for a woman carpenter in Stevensville in 1884. The men who hired her hired them to cook and to wash and to mind children, and Ada could do none of those things and would not have if she could. She went to every wheelwright and joiner within a day's ride, and was turned away at each kindly by some and with laughter by others, and by the end of the 1st week her $4 had become 2, and the 2 would not last, and she understood she was very near the edge of the kind of trouble that does not let a person go. It was the auctioneer who unknowingly saved her, a fat and cheerful man named Pruitt, who cried the county sales, and who announced one Saturday on the steps of the land office that the old Mercer place out on the Valley Road would be sold for back taxes, the whole parcel house and barn, and 40 acres to the highest bidder, and that bidding would open at $50. Ada had no business at that auction. She went because it was free and because standing in a crowd was warmer than sitting alone. Yet she listened, the way Elias had taught her to listen, and she heard something in the talk around her that the men saying it did not hear themselves. The Mercer place, they said, was cursed ground. Old Jonas Mercer had built it in the 50s, one of the first to come into the valley, and had done well for himself, running cattle and freighting until the bad winter of '54, when something happened that no one could quite agree on. Some said Mercer had been robbed of everything he had by a partner who skipped to California. Some said he had simply lost his nerve and his money in the same season. What everyone agreed on was that Jonas Mercer had died poor and strange in the winter of '55, that his only son had gone east and never returned, and that the house had stood empty for nearly 30 years, while the county tried and failed to sell it, because no one wanted 40 acres that grew nothing but the memory of a ruined man. The house sold that day for $55 to a rancher who wanted the acreage and meant to pull the buildings down for the lumber. Then Pruitt, in the cheerful way of auctioneers, had one more item, and he announced it as a joke. The barn, he said, was technically a separate lot, the old Mercer freight barn that sat a quarter-mile off the house on its own deeded square, too far gone to be worth hauling, and he would sell it and the small lot it sat on to anyone fool enough to bid $1 just to clear it from the county books. The crowd laughed. A man called out that he would not take it for free if he had to look at it. And Ada Vance, who had been standing at the back with 2 silver dollars in her pocket, and an idea forming that she could not yet have explained, raised her hand and said in a voice that carried farther than she meant it to, that she would give $1. The laughter that followed was the kind that is meant to be heard. Pruitt, grinning, asked the girl if she knew that the thing was falling down. Ada said that she did. A freighter near the front turned and looked at her and said that she had just bought herself a pile of rotten wood and a long walk to see it, and the men around him laughed again, and Pruitt brought down his gavel and said, "Sold. To the young lady for $1, and may God have mercy on her hammer." Ada paid the $1. She drew it from her pocket and laid it in Pruitt's broad palm, the second to last coin she owned, and she felt the eyes of the crowd on the back of her neck like the sun on a long afternoon. A woman beside the steps, a rancher's wife in a good wool coat, leaned to another and said, not quietly, that it was a shame what became of girls with no people, that the poor thing had clearly lost her wits along with her place. Ada heard it. She had heard a great many such things in 11 years and had learned that the trick was not to answer them, but to let them pass through her, like cold water through a sluice, taking nothing with them. She did not explain herself, then or ever, to any of them. She walked the 3 miles out the valley road that same afternoon, with Elias Frame's tool chest waiting back at the livery and $1 silver left in her pocket, and she went to look at what she had bought. What she had bought was worse than they had said. The Mercer freight barn stood at the end of a wagon track grown over with cheatgrass and wild rose, a great gaunt structure of squared timber and board siding that had once been painted the deep red of iron oxide and had weathered to the color of old blood. The roof had failed along its whole western slope. The big freight doors hung open and crooked on hinges eaten half through with rust, and inside the light came down in dusty bars through the broken roof, and lay across a floor that 30 years of weather had warped and blackened. It smelled of rot and rat and cold stone. Any sensible person would have turned around. Ada did not turn around. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust, and she began, without quite deciding, to read the building, the way Elias had taught her to read a building. And the first thing the barn told her, before she had taken a single step inside, was that it had been built by a man who did not intend it to fall down. The frame was mortise and tenon oak where oak was needed, the joints pegged not nailed, the kind of work that took twice as long and lasted 4 times as long, the work of a man who meant to leave something behind. The rot was all in the skin of the building, the siding and the shingles. The parts a poor man neglects first, the bones were sound. Whoever Jonas Mercer had been, he had not been a careless man, and a careful man, Elias used to say, does not do careful work on a thing he means to abandon. That was the first thread, and Ada felt it catch. Why would a man build a freight barn this well, a 1/4 mile from his house on its own deeded lot, and then let his whole fortune slip away and die poor inside of it? She had no answer. She had learned, though, not to need an answer all at once, only to keep pulling gently on the thread until the rest came loose. She set down her satchel of tools just inside the door, and she began to work, and the working was the only prayer she knew. For the first 3 days she did nothing but make the structure safe. She could not investigate a building that might fall on her, and so she shored the failing roof beam with a post cut from a fallen pine, and braced the leaning south wall and cleared the floor of 30 years of fallen debris, hauling it out by the armload into the spring sun. The post she cut for the failing roof beam she cut from a wind-thrown pine at the wood's edge, limbing it with a hatchet from Elias's chest, and dragging it up the wagon track on her own shoulder a length at a time, and when she set it under the sagging ridge and drove the wedges home with the 12-pound maul, the whole structure settled a 1/2 inch and held, and the sound it made was the sound of a thing deciding to stand. She slept those nights wrapped in her shawl on the soundest corner of the loft, a vivid red shawl Elias had bought her at a trading post, the one Christmas he had money, the only soft thing she owned. She woke before light each morning with her breath showing in the cold and her hands stiff as green wood, and she worked them loose against the maul handle and went back to it, because the work did not care that she was tired, and neither, she had decided, would she. She ate what little she could buy with her last dollar, and then what she could trap, and her hands, which were already a working woman's hands, blistered and split and healed harder. The men in town who thought of her at all assumed she had given up and moved on. She had not moved on. She was learning the barn's secrets one beam at a time. It was on the 4th day that the loft began to trouble her. The Mercer barn had a hayloft that ran the full length of the western half, a heavy plank floor laid over joists a good 14 feet above the main floor, and as Ada worked beneath it she found that she kept looking up. Something about the loft floor was wrong. She could not say what at first, only that her eye, trained by 11 years to find the place where a thing did not match itself, kept returning to it. And on the fourth evening, standing in the last of the light with her neck aching from looking up, she finally saw what had been troubling her, and once she had seen it, she could not understand how she had missed it. The loft floor was too thick. From below, where the joist showed, she could see that the floor laid over them was not a single layer of planking as every loft she had ever known was built, but two layers, an upper floor and a lower one, with a space between them of perhaps 8 inches. No one builds a hayloft with a false floor. There was no reason on earth to do it, no reason that served any honest purpose of storing hay or housing freight. And the moment Ada understood what she was looking at, the whole shape of the mystery turned over in her mind, like a key turning in a lock, and Elias Frame's voice came to her across the cold months since his death, telling her that a thing built honest will tell you the truth, but that now and then a man builds a thing to lie, and that the lie is always the most interesting part. She did not sleep that night. She lay in her red shawl and looked up at the underside of the false floor and made herself wait until morning, because the loft was old and she would not climb to it by lantern light and risk a fall with no one within 3 miles to find her. At first light, she went up the loft ladder rung by rung, testing each, and she stood on the upper floor of the loft for the first time. And she began the work that would take her the better part of 2 weeks and would answer the question the whole county had stopped asking 30 years before. The upper floor was laid tight and pegged, good dry planking that had been protected from the weather by the loft above it, and was sound as the day it was set. To reach the space between the floors, she would have to lift those planks without splitting them, and to lift them she would have to find where they had been meant to be lifted, because a man who builds a hidden space builds a way into it. She got down on her knees and she went over the floor by hand, inch by inch, reading the grain and the peg holes and the faint scuff of old wear, and on the second day of looking she found it. Near the north gable, 4 planks whose pegs were not pegs at all but cleverly fitted wooden plugs, set to be drawn out by anyone who knew they were there. Her hands were shaking when she drew the first plug. She made them stop. She drew the 4 plugs and set them in a row beside her knee, and she lifted the first plank, and the smell that came up out of the dark between the floors was the smell of air that had been sealed away from the world for 30 years, dry and cold, and faintly sweet with the scent of old oiled paper and cedar. She lifted the second plank and the third, and the light fell down into the hidden space, and Ada Vance went very still. The space between the floors was not empty. It had never been empty. Laid out in the dark, wrapped in oiled canvas and packed in cedar shavings against the damp, were the things a man hides when he means to save them from someone, and Ada understood in the space of a held breath that she was looking at the whole truth of Jonas Mercer, sealed away by his own hand and waiting 30 years for a pair of hands that knew how to find it. There was a strongbox first, a small iron strongbox the size of a seed crate, and it was heavy in a way that told her before she opened it what kind of weight was inside. There were ledger books, 3 of them, bound in leather gone stiff with age, wrapped each in its own canvas. There was a leather wallet of papers tied with a faded ribbon. And there was, laid carefully on top of all of it as though it were the most important thing of all, a single folded letter sealed with wax, with a name written on the outside in a careful hand, and the name was not Mercer. The name on the letter was Tarn. Ada sat back on her heels in the dust and the falling light, and she did not touch the letter for a long moment, because the sight of that name had stopped the breath in her throat. Tarn. Royce Tarn, who had cast her out with $4. She had heard it said in town that the Tarns were an old valley family, that Royce's father had come into the country in the early days, but she had never thought to connect the man who fed her like a stray to the cursed ground she had bought for $1. Now the connection lay in her hands, sealed in wax, 30 years old, and she understood that the thread she had been pulling gently for 2 weeks ran straight back into her own life. She opened the strong box first, because the letter frightened her and the box did not. Inside, wrapped in chamois, were gold coins, double eagles, $20 pieces minted in the 50s, and she counted them with hands that had grown steady again, because counting was work, and work was the thing she knew how to do. There were 240 of them, $4,800 in gold, sealed in the loft of a barn for 30 years, while the man who hid it died poor and strange, and the county wrote his name off as a ruined fool. Ada looked at the gold for a long time. Then she set it aside because the gold, she already sensed, was not the truth of the thing. The truth was in the ledgers and the letter, and she was afraid of it, and she made herself reach for it anyway. The ledgers told the story in a hand grown shaky toward the end. Jonas Mercer had been, in the years before '54, the most successful freighter in the Upper Valley, hauling supply to the mining camps in the mountains and bringing ore and hides back down. And he had taken on a partner in '51 to share the cost of wagons and teams, a younger man with a good head for figures and a gift for being liked. The partner's name, written out 100 times across those pages in Mercer's careful hand, was Cornelius Tarn, Royce Tarn's father. Ada read the ledgers by lantern light over 3 nights, and the more she read, the colder she grew, because she was watching a robbery happen one entry at a time. Cornelius Tarn had kept the books for the partnership. That was the arrangement, Mercer hauling and Tarn accounting, and for 2 years the books ran honest. Then, in the autumn of '53, the entries in Tarn's portion of the ledger began very quietly to diverge from the truth. A load of ore valued at $600 was entered as 3. A payment received was recorded as a payment owed. Money that came into the partnership left it again through a dozen small false doors, each one too small to notice on its own, all of them together bleeding the concern white over the course of a single year. By the bad winter of '54, on paper, the partnership was insolvent, and the debt was all Mercer's, secured against his land and his name, and Cornelius Tarn held the paper. Mercer had figured it out too late. The last pages of the third ledger were not accounts at all, but a kind of testament, written in the winter of '55 by a man who knew he had been ruined by his friend and could prove it to no one, because the proof was the books themselves, and the books, in the county's eyes, were Tarn's honest record and Mercer's own ruin. He wrote that he had confronted Tarn, and that Tarn had been gentle and sorrowful and immovable, that Tarn had told him the books were the books, and that no court in the territory would take the word of a failed freighter over the clean accounts of his prosperous partner. He wrote that he had hidden the true reckoning, and the gold he had managed to keep back in the one place Tarn would never think to look. The loft of the freight barn, Tarn had always said, was a waste of good oak. He wrote that he was an old man and tired, and that he would not give Tarn the satisfaction of watching him beg. And he wrote in the last entry a single line that Ada would carry for the rest of her life, that he trusted the truth would keep in the cold and the dark until it found a better hand than his. The letter, sealed in wax, was the proof made plain. It was Mercer's sworn statement, witnessed and signed, laying out the whole fraud in language a court could not ignore, naming Cornelius Tarn and the falsified entries and the land taken under a debt that had never truly existed. Mercer had meant to send it. Something, fear or pride or the simple failure of his body, had stopped him, and he had sealed it instead with the rest and trusted it to the cold. The land it concerned, the original Mercer homestead and freighting concern, was the very ground in Stevensville on which Royce Tarn now ran the warehouse he was preparing to sell. Before the snow, Ada Vance understood then what she held. She held the proof that the Tarn family fortune had been built on a theft, that the warehouse Royce Tarn was about to sell for a comfortable retirement, and Helena sat on land stolen from a man who had died poor because of it, and that the only living person who had ever cared what happened to her had spent 11 years mending the wagons of the family that had done it, never knowing. She held enough gold to change her own life entirely and walk away. And she held a choice, and she sat with it for 3 days in the rotted barn before she made it. And the choice she made was the kind that does not get a person rich. She did not go to Royce Tarn. She had learned from the ledgers exactly what confrontation was worth against a man who held the paper, which was nothing. She did not go to the gold either beyond what she needed to live while she did the thing she had decided to do. What she did instead was the patient and unglamorous work of making the truth undeniable, because a sealed letter in a barn loft was a story, and a story could be called a forgery or a madwoman's find, but a story properly brought into the light, witnessed and recorded and matched against the public record, became a fact that no amount of clean accounting could dissolve. She began by finding the one man in the county who might remember. The old survivor of that time was a freighter named Hollis Webb, 80 years old and nearly blind, who had hauled alongside Mercer in the early days and who lived now on the charity of a granddaughter in a cabin on the South Road. Ada walked to him with the ledgers in her satchel and her red shawl against the spring cold, and she read the entries aloud to him, and the old man wept, not for the gold, but because he had watched Jonas Mercer die believing himself a fool, and had always known in his bones that something had been wrong and had never been able to name it. Hollis Webb remembered the loads. He remembered the ore that had gone down the valley and the money that had never come back up, and his memory sat beside Mercer's books, turned a dead man's testament into a living witness's account. There was a wronged party still alive, and finding her was the heart of the thing. Jonas Mercer's son had gone east and died there, but he had left a daughter, a granddaughter of Jonas, a woman named Clara Mercer, who worked as a seamstress in Missoula, and who had grown up believing her grandfather had thrown away the family's fortune through weakness and bad luck. Ada wrote to her and then went to her, and she laid the ledgers and the letter and the sworn statement on the seamstress's table, and she watched a woman learn, in the space of an hour, that the shame she had carried her whole life had never been hers to carry. Clara was a spare, careful woman near 40, with her grandfather's long hands and a seamstress's habit of touching a thing to know it, and she ran her fingers along the stiffened leather of the ledgers as though she could read them by feel. She turned to the last page where Jonas Mercer had written that he trusted the truth would keep in the cold and the dark until it found a better hand than his, and she read it twice, her lips moving the second time. Clara Mercer did not weep the way the old man had. She went very quiet, the way Ada herself went. Quiet, the quiet of a person rearranging 30 years of belief in the space of an hour, and the only sound in the small room was a clock somewhere behind the curtain. Then she set her hand flat on the ledger, and she asked what it would take to set it right. What it took was months. It took a lawyer in Missoula, an honest one, paid out of 40 of the Double Eagles, who understood that the case was not a treasure claim but a matter of a falsified record and a fraudulently secured debt, and who knew how to bring such a thing before a territorial court. It took the ledgers entered into evidence and Hollis Webb's testimony taken down before he died, which he did peacefully, that autumn having lived just long enough to say the thing he had carried for 30 years. It took the gold itself, every coin of it declared and accounted for honestly before the court, because Ada had understood from the start that the moment she spent $1 of it in secret, she became no better than Cornelius Tarn, and the whole power of what she carried lay in her hands being clean. Royce Tarn was never confronted. Ada never spoke a word to him through the whole of it. He learned what was happening the way such men always learn, through his own lawyer in a quiet office, the foundation of his family's comfort dissolving not in a shouted accusation. He fought it, of course. He called the ledgers forgeries and the letter a fabrication, and the whole affair the scheme of a vengeful girl he had once charitably housed. The books, however, were in Jonas Mercer's hand, and the hand was proved, and the saw marks and the nail cuts and the very oak of the barn dated the hiding place to the years it claimed, and Hollis Webb's deposition spoke from beyond the grave, and one truth at a time the territorial court did what no living person had been able to do for 30 years. The debt against the Mercer land was declared void from its origin. The Stevensville warehouse and the ground beneath it were restored to the heir of Jonas Mercer, to Clara, who had carried a shame that was never hers. Royce Tarn did not go to Helena that autumn, or any autumn after. He did not go to prison either, for the man who had done the thing was 30 years dead, and the law has little reach into a grave. He simply became, in the space of a season, what Jonas Mercer had been made to seem, a man whose name no longer meant what it had, who sold what little remained truly his and left the valley quietly and was not much spoken of again. Ada took no satisfaction in it that she would have called satisfaction. The ledgers had taught her that a man undone by the truth is not a triumph to be savored, but simply a wrong stopped, and that the difference between justice and revenge is that justice does not need an audience. The gold went where Ada had decided it would go in the rotted barn, before she knew Clara Mercer's name or had any guarantee of anything. After the court costs and the lawyer's fee, what remained of the $4,800 went to Clara because it had been her grandfather's, kept back from the theft by his own hand, and it was not Ada's to keep. Clara tried to refuse it. Then she tried to give half of it to Ada, who had found it and freed it and asked nothing. Ada would not take the half. What she took in the end, after long argument across the seamstress's table, was the barn, the rotted Mercer freight barn, and the small deeded lot it stood on, which she had already bought for $1 and already owned, but which Clara insisted on buying back from her at a price that was fair, so that Ada would have the one thing she had truly wanted from the beginning, which was a place of her own and the means to mend it. She mended it. That was the work of years, and Ada Vance gave them gladly. She tore the rotted siding from the sound oak bones and clad the barn anew in milled cedar that would last. She raised a new roof over Jonas Mercer's honest frame, and she rebuilt the failed wall, and she turned the great freight floor into a wheelwright's and joiner's shop, the only one in the upper valley run by a woman. And the men who had laughed on the auction steps brought their wagons to her within 5 years, because her work was better than any work to be had between the ranges, and good work in the end is the only argument that cannot be answered. She kept the loft. She drew no new floor over the hidden space. She left it open, the 4 plugged planks lifted and laid aside, so that anyone who climbed the ladder could see the cold, dark place where the truth had kept for 30 years, waiting for a better hand. Well, the men came around in the way that doubters do, not with apologies, which were not in them, but with their custom and their slow respect, and now and then an awkward word on the way out the door about how they supposed she had known something they had not. Ada never said, "I told you so." The barn said it for her standing sound and busy, and hers, the deep red of fresh iron oxide paint on its new siding, catching the valley light. And that was enough, and more than the men deserved. Hollis Webb was buried that autumn in the Stevensville cemetery, and Ada paid for the stone, and she had cut into it, beneath his name, the single thing he had wanted said, which was that he had hauled honest. Clara Mercer moved back into the valley and took up the restored homestead, and the 2 women, the seamstress and the carpenter, became the nearest thing each had to family, which neither had expected and both came to need. And once a year, on the anniversary of the day she had drawn the 4 plugs from the loft floor, Ada climbed the ladder alone and sat by the open dark with her red shawl around her shoulders and Elias Frame's 12-pound maul resting across her knees, the hickory handle worn to the shape of a dead man's grip. And she thought about what he had told her on the cold afternoons of her girlhood, that a thing built honest will tell you the truth if you have the patience to listen. She had listened. That was the whole of it in the end. A girl with $4 and a dead man's tools had been thrown away by the world, and she had bought the thing the world threw away, and she had been patient enough and skilled enough to hear what it had been waiting 30 years to say. The gold had gone where it belonged. The shame had gone where it belonged. And the barn that the whole county had called a ruin not worth $1, stood at the end of the valley road. Sound to its oak bones, the work of an honest hand restored by another, and it was the truest thing for miles. Did someone once look at you and see only what you were worth to them at that minute, and miss entirely what you had been and what you might yet become? Tell me about it, because Ada Vance would have understood. And if this story stayed with you, there is another like it of a thing the world threw away, and the patient hand that found the truth inside it, waiting for you to begin. Ada lived a long life in the Bitterroot Valley, and she was not lonely in it, though she never married and never wished to. And when she was very old, the children of the valley knew her as the carpenter in the red barn, the woman whose work outlasted the men who built grander things. She is buried near Hollis Webb, and not far from the restored Mercer ground, under a plain stone. She chose herself, and the barn still stands. The cold, dark place where the truth kept is still there for anyone patient enough to climb the ladder and look, and the lesson of it is the one Elias Frame gave a watching girl in a freight yard a long time ago, that the things the world dismisses are exactly the things in which the truth most often hides, and that it waits, in the cold and the dark, for a better hand than the one that buried it.